Hey everybody, it's Mr. Schauber, and I want to talk with you guys about American imperialism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Uh, this is when America really starts to become a world power. We've already talked about immigration. We've talked about uh, after the Civil War, all the inventions and the new technology and all that kind of stuff. This period of time, this American imperialism chapter kind of covers that same period of time in U.S. history. And so all these things kind of overlap, and you can kind of see how with the immigration and Americans moving coast to coast with manifest destiny and all the technology and inventions and all this stuff is just kind of America is coming into its own. And so this is really when America becomes a world power. This chapter will look at how America now starts to acquire more territory and gets our influence into other places in the world in order to become that world power the way we want it to be. All right, so the question is, what is imperialism? Well, let's look. Oh, there's a stormtrooper. Darth Vader? So, how did the stormtrooper and Darth Vader relate to the idea of imperialism? Well, if you have seen Star Wars, and for all you Star Wars fans, you should probably know the answer. I grew up on Star Wars. Man, we used to wear out those old VHS tapes, of the originals and awesome stuff. But what does it have to do with imperialism? Well, imperialism is when stronger nations attempt to create empires by dominating weaker nations. So your Stormtrooper and your Darth Vader, they were part of the Empire, right? And uh, this in real life, imperialism is when empires are built by one strong country by conquering other weaker nations. And so that is, you know, a lot of countries got into empire building, uh, especially European countries in the 17 and 1800s. A lot of European countries went into Africa, went into Southeast Asia, um, places like that. And of course, they were already in Latin America back from the 15 and 1600s. But that's how France and England and Italy and the Netherlands and so forth built up their empires. And of course, the English Empire was world famous. You know, the saying was the sun never sets on the British Empire. They had holdings from Canada to South Africa to Australia and everywhere in between. And so the United States said, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should get involved a little bit. Uh, Maybe some conquering, but also some buying up. Manifest destiny applies, and maybe it's Americans' destiny to go into other places to trade and to live and things like that. And so this is the time period where we get involved in this. All right, let's take a step back for a second. Kind of an interesting question. What's the best purchase you've ever made and why? Think about that for a minute. What's the best thing you've ever bought? The thing that you've enjoyed the most? Okay, think about that. And now we're going to look at one of the purchases the U.S. made that turned out to be a great deal. But before we do that, think about what is the worst purchase you've ever made and why. So what's the best one? What's the worst one? Well, in 1867, just 2 years after the Civil War ended, our Secretary of State, William Seward, bought Alaska from Russia. Most Americans ridiculed him at the time. They thought it was just a waste of money. They said that Seward had bought walrus-covered icebergs, in a barren, worthless region. But in the end, the Senate ratified the purchase, and the U.S. Took possession of Alaska. It turned out to be an amazing buy. It turned out to be rich in natural resources, everything from gold to oil, of course, timber, and of course, Russia eventually said, "Hey, we think we made a mistake. We want it back." And we said, "Sorry." So This turned out to be one of the best purchases the U.S. has ever made. And if you've ever gone to Alaska, you know it's just this vast region, still very primitive in a lot of ways, but an amazing place to visit as far as the views, the scenery, the wildlife is just incredible there. So that's one of the best purchases we've ever made. Americans had also showed their interest in the Pacific during the mid to late 1800s. And in 1853, an American fleet led by Commodore Matthew C. Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay and in Japan and opened it up for trade. The Japanese had long lived by a policy called sakoku, which was closed country. They did not want foreigners coming into their country, and foreigners weren't welcome. That they had kind of experimented with that back uh, in like the 1600s, and it hadn't worked real well. And they didn't like the influence they thought the foreigners were bringing. So they didn't allow foreigners into their country for a long time. And so when he sails up and says, "Hey, I'm coming into the harbor," and they said, "No, you're not. Turn around. You're not welcome here." He says, "Too late. We're in. Let's trade." And so this brings on an interesting story in and of itself. We pull up to trade, and the Japanese realize that I guess the Americans are here. Okay, Americans, what do you have to show us? And so we pull out a scaled down version of a train and show them how it works. They had never seen anything like that before. We pull out a cannon and say, "Hey, pick something you want us to hit, knock down." And so they pick something, and we shot a cannonball and knocked it over, uh, and they were amazed. Okay, and then we said, "Hey, what do you have to show us? What trade items can you offer to us?" This is crazy. So before I show you what the Japanese showed us, here's the question. If a foreigner that knew nothing about the United States came to this country right now, and you could take them anywhere in the nation, what would be the one thing you'd show them that, in your opinion, defines what America is all about? What's the one thing that defines what America is? Okay, and your answer could vary, right? Maybe you take them to a baseball game. Maybe you take them to the Statue of Liberty. Maybe you take them to uh, the Lincoln Memorial. Maybe you take them to the Grand Canyon. Maybe who knows, right? Maybe you take them out for a hamburger and some French fries, right? But that's up to you. But what is the thing that you'd show them that is America? Okay, well, thinking about that, let's look at what the Japanese showed us. That was Japan. All right. So what did the Japanese show Commodore Perry and the Americans to impress them? The Japanese say, "Okay, guys, we love that train. We love that cannon that you just shot off. Uh, just stay right here on the beach. We'll be back in a minute." And a few minutes later, they come back with these two huge Japanese dudes, and they draw a circle in the sand in the beach, and they show us a sumo match, a sumo wrestling match. That is Japan. All right. So kind of crazy. If you've never seen a sumo match, they're pretty interesting. But this is an ancient sport in Japan, very respected. These sumo wrestlers are usually very, very large men, and and literally you can kind of see the almost like a raised area, a little rope raised area that's a circle around the circle, and they're trying to push each other out of the circle. That's what they do. And the first person who pushes the other guy out of the circle at all wins, and that's the classic sumo. But uh, this is what the Japanese showed us to impress us. All right. Well, the United States also went to some other places for trade, and we went to places like the Midway Islands in the Pacific as well. And we kind of established that as like a refueling station. We went into places like China to trade, uh, you know, and we wanted to increase our influence. Of course, American businesses wanted to increase their markets as well by going overseas, and they did. But something huge happens in 1898 that really establishes us as a burgeoning world power militarily, as well as economically. We already knew that we by this time were living. The average American was living fairly well compared to the average person in other places. Not as well as we do today, but fairly well for the time period. But what establishes us as really a burgeoning world power? The answer is the Spanish-American War. This is one of those wars that most Americans don't know anything about. We don't even think about hardly. But this is the war that really kind of puts us on the map. And the other European countries now have to look at us and really respect us militarily. And they look at America as just this up and comer, as far as world strength goes. The Europeans always consider themselves to be superior, and even though we defeated England twice, right, in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, they still kind of thought they were superior to us. Of course, they had much larger overseas colonies, and their empire was much bigger. But we always, thought that we were kind of underappreciated, and so in 1898, something happens to solidify our position as a power in the world, and that's the Spanish-American War. So, how did the U.S. get involved in the war? Well, let's look at the background of this. Let's learn a little bit about this. All right, you can see by 1900, basically, or 1898, what was going on. We'd got Alaska, we got the Midway Islands. We'll talk about Hawaii here in a little bit, but a lot of places in the Pacific we'd kind of extended our influence to. We also had our sights set a little bit on the Caribbean, and of course Puerto Rico's there, Cuba is there, and then if you look over into the Far East, you have the Philippines, the Far East Pacific area, the Philippines. Well, what does Cuba and the Philippines have to do with this? Well, I have arrows pointing to them. Well, the answer is that Spain controlled both areas. Spain, of course, the Philippines is named after King Philip of Spain from the way back when, in like the 1500s. And Cuba was controlled by Spain as well. And Spain, of course, had been a dominant world power in the 15 and 1600s, even into the 1700s. But by the late 1800s, the Spanish Empire was a shell of what it had been in previous centuries. They were not nearly as strong as they once were. And so what was happening here? Well, let's look at how the United States and Spain are on a collision course. There are multiple factors that lead us into the Spanish-American War, and one of them has to do with this guy, Valeriano Weyler. In Cuba, the people wanted to be free from Spanish control. They didn't want to be under the control of the King of Spain, and so they wanted their independence. They wanted their freedom, and the people in Cuba started agitating for that. And Spain is not about to let Cuba win its freedom, and so the Spanish king sends his most brutal general, his most brutal military guy to Cuba to put down this rebellion, as he sees it. Cubans are killed. They are put into camps where they are starved out and worked to death, and disease spreads. And so by the time it's all said and done, over 200,000 Cubans will die as this Spanish general and his men put down this so-called rebellion in Cuba. So that's, of course, going to ignite all kinds of fury from Cubans who are living in the United States. A lot of Cubans lived in the U.S. and had relatives and friends still back in Cuba that were affected by this. And so the Cubans that are living in the U.S. and other places are they're just beside themselves at what has happened to their homeland. And so, of course, other people that see this as well, just the average person, hears about this and cannot believe that this brutality is happening. Especially Americans can't believe it. It's happening just 90 miles off our shores from the coast of Florida. And so this is a crazy thing, a kind of a wake-up call. And this is going to lead to, well, as you will see, another factor that leads us into the Spanish-American War. Another factor was the press, the media, that's going to result from these actions of Valeriano Weyler and the Spanish military. Joseph Pulitzer. Joseph Pulitzer was the owner of the New York World newspaper, one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest newspaper in New York at the end of the 1800s. And William Randolph Hearst, owner of the New York Morning Journal newspaper, um, a competitor to Joseph Pulitzer. But there were multiple newspapers in New York, but these were the two biggest. And these men are going to become extremely wealthy from their newspaper business. And then you'll see William Randolph Hearst also gets into buying up other newspapers around the country and eventually the radio business when that comes out. And he will be just crazy wealthy. I'll show you at one of his mansions in just a little bit. But um, these are the most powerful newspaper owners in New York, late 18 and early 1900s. And what's going to be their role in the Spanish-American War? Well, newspaper people love a good headline, and they love a sensational headline and sensational and crazy stories. And so that's where these guys come in. And so guys like Pulitzer and Hearst are going to use yellow journalism, is what we call it, sensational headlines and stories, sometimes true, sometimes not true, to sell tons of newspapers and get readers to believe certain things, right? How did you get your information in the late 1800s? There was no radio, no TV, no internet, so you got it from newspapers. And if a newspaper told you something, you probably believed it. And so Pulitzer and Hearst and other newspaper owners of the day across the whole country, of course, learned that when you have sensational headlines and crazy headlines and crazy stories, they sell more papers, and you can really shape public opinion by your newspapers as well, especially somebody as powerful as Pulitzer and Hearst, because their newspapers were so widely read. And so they start reporting on things that are happening in Cuba with the Spanish military and all the Cubans that are dying. Of course, some of their stories are true, and some of them are partly true, and some of them aren't very true at all. But they're going to shape Americans' opinion on what's happening in Cuba, and it's going to outrage Americans, and America starts saying, "Well, hey, we gotta go to the rescue of those poor Cubans who are being slaughtered at the hands of this butcher, Valeriano Weyler, and his Spanish military." And again, some of it's true, some of it's fabricated, but this really swings public opinion toward going against Spain and helping the Cubans. And so, of course, yellow journalism is used today. We don't necessarily call it that, but it's absolutely used today. It's all over the place. It's probably worse today than it was back then. But yellow journalism is, it's the crazy, it's the outrageous, it's the sensational. That's what sells in media, and that's what people are. I don't know why it is that way, but we're kind of naturally drawn to kind of the drama and the craziness. And so a lot of us just, we buy it, right? All right, I wanted to take a few minutes just real quick and uh, show you talking about William Randolph Hearst and just the crazy wealth that he accumulated through the media industry. And of course, using his yellow journalism at times to sell more papers, right? But out in California, he built a castle. They call it Hearst Castle. Today, it's a museum. You can pay to go through it. Just crazy though, when you look at this is. I mean, we're talking early 1900s, right? And this is the kind of wealth. We already looked at Rockefeller, Carnegie, those kind of guys, J.P. Morgan, and the kind of wealth they had compared to the average person. Hearst, is kind of in that category after a while in the early 1900s. So here's just some pictures of Hearst Castle, just as kind of a fun thing to look at real quick. There it is from, you can see it up on the hill. There's the entrance. Pretty sweet, right? You can look at those staircases and fountains he's got out front. I mean, pretty cool view, right? Just looking at the thing from the front. But then when you get inside, you see just the ornateness and just things that are hand carved and I mean, all the paintings and just unbelievable, right? Uh, it really is like a castle, like out of Europe, So this is a library area and a seating area. Crazy. Here's a dining area, and you can kind of see the tapestries and the flags and the paintings, and look at the ornate roof, or the ceiling, just the hand carved stuff. And so this, but you can see the long table, right? This is a huge long table and chairs, and here's the same room in the around Christmas time. They decorate it for the season. Here's a different room, right? And you can see I guess this is just like a living room, study area, office area, kind of thing. But all the statues and look how big that fireplace mantle is. And it's just, you think about this. I mean, think about living in something like this today, and then think about living in something like this in, 100 years ago or more. A bedroom, right? You got your billiards room, okay, to play. There's a couple of pool tables there, and the seating areas. And I mean, but just imagine. I mean, look at just how the ceiling is all carved out, and like I said, the tapestries on the walls and the paintings on the walls, and it's just, it was over the top, right? But it's just crazy. I've never been to this castle, this slash museum now, but I'd like to go someday to look at it. It'd be amazing. And then there's the outdoor pool, and you can see tourists that are there that day looking at it. But there's the outdoor pool. You got looks like the Roman or Greek, architecture, off to the side, and it's so cool. And there is the indoor pool, and of course they made the lighting and stuff just to make it look amazing. But I mean, it's just unbelievable, right? Uh, Indoor pool, and you can kind of see there's the diving board there, and if you go up a little bit and to the left, you can kind of see there's like a little hallway there. There actually is. You could swim up that little hallway to the left, and it's just incredible. So hopefully you enjoyed some Hearst Castle pictures. Now let's go back to this whole thing about uh, the Spanish-American War. So you got what's going on in Cuba with the Spanish and military putting down the Cubans' attempt at revolution, and for independence. And then you have you have the yellow journalism whipping people up and getting people's public opinion, to think a certain way. And in our case, it was Americans definitely wanting to get Spain out of Cuba and teach them a lesson. And then you have this guy, Dupuy de Lome. Dupuy de Lome was the Spanish ambassador to the U.S. So he lived in the U.S. and his goal or his job was to try to kind of keep good relations with the U.S. Well, he kind of ruins that when he writes a letter criticizing President McKinley, our U.S. president at the time. And the letter is kind of intercepted and published basically in the newspaper, saying, "Hey, look, this is what the Spanish ambassador to the U.S. thinks about our president and us." He called President McKinley weak, and he said, the U.S. was just, the U.S. was kind of wimpy, and so this outrages Americans. So this is kind of like a third strike, if you will, for Americans, right? So what's happening in Cuba, yellow journalism, and Dupuy de Lome. And kind of the fourth strike, if you want to call it that, and the last strike is this. The U.S.S. Maine battleship. We send a battleship down to Havana, Cuba, and you can see the before and the after. We are going to have it down there docked in the harbor, in Havana Harbor, in case things get out of control with Spain, right? Well, the ship is sitting in the harbor, and 1 minute, and the next minute, it looks like that on the bottom. Okay, on the bottom picture, there is a huge explosion. Uh, the ship is just a mangled mess. It will, parts of it will be blown off. And the problem is, it's not just that the ship gets blown up or have this major explosion on board. It's that more than 250 American sailors are also on board and will die as a result of this. Now, when an investigation is done, it looks like it was a fire. This is a result probably of a fire that was started in the ammunition room of this ship, and it was probably an accidental fire set by an American sailor. Okay, probably wasn't on purpose. It was just we probably did this to ourselves. But of course, we're not going to make it look like that. We're already agitating for war against Spain. We're already agitating to show how strong we are and to get Spain out of Cuba. And so we blame it on Cuba. We say, well, we blame it on Spain. We say, well, the Spanish blew up our ship. They sabotaged us. Look at this. And of course, the newspapers back home here, all right, uh, are more than happy to throw a little yellow journalism out there and and sensationalize a little bit or a lot. And so this is it for Americans now. We say, hey, we look what they did to our battleship. 250 Americans are dead now. The Spanish did this, and of course we blame it all on them. And now war with Spain is inevitable. We need to go to war with Spain. And so that's exactly what happens. Well, how does this guy play into it? Interesting enough, Theodore Roosevelt's one of the most famous Americans in U.S. history. Interesting story. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. Okay, which was a good job, but he didn't have a whole lot of authority. But what ends up happening is, after all these events, the Secretary of the Navy happens to be away, and Teddy Roosevelt, as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, basically says, "Hey, yeah, let's go to let's hey, naval ships, go here, go there, go and he starts moving some pieces around as far as our Navy is concerned. Meanwhile, in Washington D.C., President McKinley is getting all kinds of pressure to urge for war against Spain, and Congress is getting all kinds of pressure to declare war on Spain. And so, but Roosevelt moves some naval pieces around, and this is also going to help us get into war. He probably didn't really have the authority to do what he did, but well, regardless, it happened. So that's his role in the beginning of the war, and then he quits his position as Secretary of the Navy because he wants to be in the war, and he wants to adventure. This guy was the ultimate adventurer, and he joins or he starts a group that will become known as the Rough Riders, and it will gain fame in the Spanish-American War because of that. It's probably the most famous fighting group in the U.S. military during the war. And there's a picture of him on the left in his Rough Rider uniform. And then moving ahead a little bit, after the war, because of his fame that he gained in the Spanish-American War, he will be elected governor of New York. And then within 3 years, he gets nabbed to be McKinley's vice president as McKinley runs for re-election and wins. And so he becomes vice president. And shortly after, just 9 months after McKinley wins re-election, McKinley will be assassinated. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt, as the vice president, becomes president. So in the span literally of 4 years, he goes from Assistant Secretary of the Navy to U.S. president. And but yes, his role in the Spanish-American War is going to be both his actions as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and then, of course, most famously, as the leader of the Rough Riders. And so, if we had to sum this up, then we look at all these events that led to the Spanish-American War. Well, the Spanish-American War then is the war between Spain and the U.S. in 1898, in Cuba, and also the Philippines. Now, I showed you that map and had that arrow pointing to the Philippines. The Philippines was controlled by Spain in 1898, just like they controlled Cuba. Well, we go into Cuba, and start fighting the Spanish. But we also say, hey, let's go to the Philippines and get the Spanish out of the Philippines. And so this war is going to last all of just a few months. And the U.S. is going to obliterate Spain. Spain is no match for us at this point. You can see here where the map kind of plays out. We land in Cuba in June of 1898, and it was within a month basically. We capture the capital city. We also go over into the Philippines, and within a month and a half, basically capture that. Well, technically less than that for the Philippines, okay? But then we also get Guam. And so the U.S., I mean, again, within a couple of months, basically, the U.S. has taken the Spanish completely out of Cuba, of the Philippines. We have Guam. We're going to get Puerto Rico. The U.S. now, I mean, we win this war easy. And in fact, the newspapers at home called it a splendid little war, right? Basically, it was kind of a foregone conclusion, I think, at the beginning of the war that we were going to win. Didn't know if we'd win this fast, but we did. And we show now that, hey, we are a world power, just like these European countries, and we've surpassed Spain. Their glory years are over. And so this, like I said, puts the U.S. on the map as far as starting to get the respect from other powerful countries that, we're kind of up there with them on some level. Real quick then, back to the Rough Riders. I just want to show you a picture. This is the group led by Teddy Roosevelt. They stormed San Juan Hill in Cuba, which was kind of the quintessential moment. It's become that way. It's seen as that way now. But this is storming up the hill, defeating the Spanish in the most famous battle of the war. And you can see on the right there is a painting rendition, but on the left is a real picture, a real photograph with Teddy Roosevelt there standing in the middle. And Roosevelt recruited college athletes and sharpshooters and all kinds of people to be in this Rough Rider group, and they were really kind of an excellent fighting unit. But Roosevelt kind of handpicks a lot of these guys, and they become famous. Okay, and like I said, Roosevelt uses this fame to catapult himself into public office as well. All right, so now having learned about the Spanish-American War and kind of the four major things that get us involved in the war, right? Hopefully you could name those things off for me. Think about them. All right, so they are, first you had what was going on in Cuba with the Spanish and Valeriano Weyler. Next you had the yellow journalism that gets kind of molds public sentiment, public opinion against the Spanish. You have Dupuy de Lome, the Spanish ambassador, who writes a letter critical of President McKinley in the U.S. And then you also have the explosion on the U.S.S. MAINE, which kills 250 Americans. It was probably us that did it on accident, but we blame it on Spain. So all those things combined then for the Spanish-American War, it's going to be just a short little war. The U.S. obliterates the Spanish influence out of Cuba and the Philippines. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders gained fame because of it, and now America, this is a glorious, little war for America. Well, so we get we take possessions, and or at least have holdings now in Cuba and like Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam, and so we've increased our influence, our sphere of influence. Well, back in the mid 1800s, we were also looking at other places in the Pacific, including Hawaii, for influence. We've already talked about briefly the Midway Islands and so forth, but in Hawaii, great natural resources, of course. It's a tropical paradise. If you've ever been there, it's just beautiful. Hawaii had always been its own nation, right? And they had a king. The Native Hawaiians had a king, and and in 1891, their king dies, and his sister, Queen LILIUOKALANI, assumes the throne. She will end up being the last monarch of Hawaii, and the reason why is because in 1893 she is dethroned. She's overthrown. Just 2 years into her reign. Well, what happens? How does she get overthrown? Well, she actually gets overthrown with the help of this guy, Sanford B. Dole. Businessman, saw dollar signs in Hawaii, and with the help of some U.S. Marines, they overthrow the Queen and take over basically control of the islands. This guy wanted the land, of course, to grow his fruit, right? Dole bananas, Dole pineapple. And he is going to make a fortune off this. And so this is kind of how the U.S. really gets control of Hawaii. Now, it doesn't become a state for quite a few decades after this, okay? But it is under U.S. control basically after Sanford Dole and the Marines take it over. And so that's how we get Hawaii. Now, this is a source of, it's kind of a sore spot even today, especially among Native Hawaiians. They're saying, hey, wait a minute, we got our land taken from us. We got our land stolen from us basically by the U.S. And they're right. You can't deny that. But it's worked out how it's worked out. And in history is history in this case. And so that's how the U.S. gets control of Hawaii, though. All right. Well, President McKinley, U.S. president from 1897 to 1901, is assassinated in 1901. Like we said, when he is shot and killed, and when he dies, now his vice president Teddy Roosevelt will become president. And here is Teddy Roosevelt, and we've already seen this slide. I explained this stuff to you before, but just to reemphasize, this is his basically the stepping stones from Assistant Secretary of the Navy to the U.S. presidency in 4 years, right? And here is President Teddy Roosevelt, a picture of him. He will be president from 1901 to 1909. He serves all but 9 months of that first term. Okay, he takes over 9 months into McKinley's second term, so he'll serve 3 years and 3 months as president, and then he runs for re-election in 1904, wins, and will leave office in early 1909. So he becomes the youngest U.S. president when he assumes the presidency after McKinley's death. Roosevelt did a number of things as president. Of course, we know he was a great outdoorsman. He loved nature. He set aside a bunch of land for national parks, especially out in the West. And he was a great adventurer, right? Willing to take some risks. He was a tough leader as well, especially on the monopolies of the day. And he broke up some of the big monopoly companies that dominated U.S. markets. And he was known as the trust buster. Sometimes a monopoly is called a trust. So he was the trust buster. So he he did a number of things economically, geographically, kind of on the map as far as setting aside national park lands and things like that. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the Panama Canal. Perhaps. It's debatable, but this is definitely one of his big accomplishments. Basically, long story short, what had happened was a French company had gotten the rights to build a canal through Panama, and it didn't work out for them. They couldn't get the job done. It was costing too much. It's very dangerous to do this. This is a tropical area down there in Panama and stuff. So the guys were dying of malaria, yellow fever, the mosquitoes, and the just Mother Nature was getting it to them. And so the U.S., long story short, like I said, will take control of the rights to build a canal. And why would you want to build a canal in Panama? Well, for obvious reasons. The main reasons being economic, trade, right, and travel. And so they're going to build this canal through Panama. It's going to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And like I say up here, it revolutionized trade in the world and travel. No longer do you have to go from New York all the way down the coast of Brazil, down the tip of South America, up the coast of Argentina and through Chile, and all the way to San Francisco. Okay, you don't have to go all the way around South America anymore. You can go through Panama, and it cuts your trip, as far as time goes, way down. And it's going to allow trade goods to go faster and safer from one place to another in the world, from the Americas to the Pacific to Asia and so forth. And it's just going to change everything. And so the U.S. starts construction on this. Um, really in 1904 while Roosevelt is president. And then by 1909, early 1909, he's out of the White House. It will take 5 more years to finish, but eventually the Panama Canal is done. So it takes a decade to build. But Roosevelt kind of oversees the first half of it and really gets it going and gets the project on its feet. And because of that, that's part of his legacy. So, but this Panama Canal is the influence of the Panama Canal, you can't say enough about it. And you can go on cruises through the Panama Canal today, pretty cool. And is a system of what they call locks and things where the water is raised or lowered, for parts of your trip, certain passages of your trip and things. But pretty amazing, amazing stuff. And you can see here is kind of the closer up view, right, of the canal. And you go through it, and it's just, yeah, crazy, right? Just awesome. Amazing that they could do this. Now, a lot of Americans lose their lives in the building of the canal. And like I said, it's very dangerous. A lot of guys will, um, you know, sacrifice everything to build this, but it is an absolute miracle of engineering, and it's one of the great construction projects of all time.